And welcome back to our panel discussion, FASA Revisited, Precedents in Commercial Item Preference, sponsored by Palantir on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. Our guests again are Jeff Kosis, the Senior Procurement Executive at the General Services Administration, and Bill Greenwalt, Senior Fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. And since we spent a fair deal of time in our last segment talking about challenges, let's, Jeff, talk a little bit about what GSA at least is doing to solve some of the challenges around buying more commercial items, one of which is something you announced recently, which is the Commercial Solutions opening. Share a little bit about what you hope to achieve through that.
Absolutely. One of the really nice authorities that Congress gave us was for commercial solution openings. While GSA does not have OTA authority, we do have CSO, Commercial Solution Opening Authority, and in some ways it's a similar concept. Commercial solution openings are intended to be competitive. In fact, they are fully competitive, but they're not FAR-based. So we find them particularly useful when we're trying to acquire some of the cutting-edge IT, some of the emerging technology, or when we're trying to deal with companies who are not often dealing with the government. While they're competitive, anybody can come in. Companies who have been reluctant to deal with us because of other terms and conditions sometimes are more willing to come in because of the flexibility in our Commercial Solution Opening Authority. So we stood up this authority in the last couple of months, announcing even a new part of our GSAM, our operating internal regulations. We've now run the first 2 acquisitions off of it, and what we saw, I think, was interesting in both cases. In one, we had a Silicon Valley firm who's never dealt with the government before come in and offer some really interesting technology that kind of blew away everything else that we had seen. In the other one, we think it was successful because in CSOs we're not presuming that we have data rights at the end of the day. So that flexibility, not spending the time on these issues, is what let us move forward. Hand in hand, we have a number of other initiatives, Jared, I think are well worth exploring, all about trying to bring innovation back into the acquisition life cycle. One of several, and it's actually larger, I think, in consequence than CSOs. In recent months, we reached agreement with the Small Business Administration to participate in the SBIR program, and we began with phase 3, the commercialization phase. So now, for the first time, we are providing assisted acquisition services to other agencies who are looking to run with SBIR and to actually bring things to the marketplace.
Let me go back to the Commercial Solutions opening for just a second. The first time I ever heard that term was when the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental came up with it, and I'm just wondering how much of the concept you borrowed from them. Also, they actually do have OTA authority, you do not, so how does yours work in compared to the DoD version of a CSO?
Okay. Both GSA and DHS were given CSO authority in the 2017 NDAA. It's a temporary authority. I think it's 5 years. Each has a $10 million ceiling per task or per contract awarded. OTAs are often used much more in the R&D space. The CSOs, we're concentrating on something that's already commercial, but cutting-edge commercial, things that are just at that emerging stage. You know, in the first segment, we talked about how we're no longer so much the drivers of innovation as the folks who try and leverage it. So with CSOs, we're trying to catch that spark, that moment that something has been created, but it has not necessarily hit that wide market acceptance yet.
Anything more you can share about what those first 2 procurements were about and what seems to have worked well and not so well, lessons learned?
From a complexity standpoint, we find it's no easier to work outside the FAR. If anything, it's a little more difficult. But at the same time, because we are now really taking ownership of the decision-making, of the discretion of what to apply, why to apply it, so you can imagine that leads to lots of really good conversations. Which clause do we need and why and what's the purpose? So if we really think about that role of the contracting officer as that business advisor for the organization, somebody's going to figure out what is the best way to buy it, and we give them a lot more playing room. That's what CSOs are to us. So in the right place, at the right moment, it's a tremendous tool, but it's a single tool. It's not an answer for every procurement situation.
And Bill, this all sounds like exactly the direction Congress was trying to nudge the department in the last few NDAAs, right?
No, absolutely, and it's almost ironic that the GSA seems to be moving faster sometimes than the Department of Defense, and I think that's a great reflection on where the idea of Congress giving these authorities to multiple amount of agencies and seeing what agency moves out faster, and then the best practices can be used from that. The best practices can be used from the contracts from each of these agencies.
Well, let's talk a bit about why DoD has moved a little bit slowly in some of these reforms, and there are a lot of examples of this, I think. I mean, 2016 NDAA was a big year for DoD. That's when you guys expanded OTA authority. You created this new 804 authority for rapid prototyping and rapid fielding. The department is just now getting into some of that implementation work, and well, let me just have you react to that and offer some views on why that might be the case and whether or not it's frustrating to members.
It's definitely taken a few years for the department to get its arms around these authorities. These authorities were put in place by Congress primarily to move the acquisition system faster in reaction to what was then perceived as the impending great power threat. And I think what has happened is that perhaps in the Armed Services Committees, that view was seen to be more critical in the 2015-2016 timeframe, and the department is now kind of caught up to, yes, there's a threat, and yes, indeed, we need to move faster, and now we have these authorities, and we're actually going to use them. So I'm very optimistic now, seeing that they're starting to use these authorities, but there are so many that were put in place in 2015 and 2016 that we don't even have regulations for yet, and so we're gonna have to just see how the department gets its arms around that and starts executing.
Let me pick up on that, because one surprising thing about that delay in the regulatory process is that sometimes, as you said, it can take 2 years for a regulation implementing a law to come out, but there have been a couple cases where the implementation guidance has been basically just cut and pasted from the statute. And again, the surprising thing is it makes you go, why did that take 2 years? So I guess there is a question here, I promise. The question is it possible for a smart contracting officer or other acquisition official to just read the statute and run with it, or do they need to wait for implementation guidance every time one of these reforms gets passed?
I don't know that I'd say that's an either-or question. I'd suggest that there's plenty of room for both. Part of why we have common regulations is we want the agencies having the same interpretation of the statute. Part of why the FAR was created was to solve the problem of dozens of agencies interpreting laws just slightly differently. It drives costs through the roof for industry. It results in huge training needs as folks migrate from one agency to another, and it results in a lot of confusion. So it's great for the procurement lawyers, it's great for the oversight community, but in terms of effective mission delivery, you need a consistent set of standards and a consistent understanding of what does the language mean, what is the law going to deliver. That said, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to move faster than we can go through the regulatory process. And that's why we have authority to do deviations. As an example, we got authority a couple of years ago to respond much faster to a presidentially declared disaster. Previously, we needed to wait for Secretary of Defense to issue a declaration before we can invoke authorities to raise the thresholds. But because we decided, hey, we have authorities, we have deviations, sometimes we don't want to wait for the regulatory process. We implemented our own set of deviations, and that let us be much faster in responding to the string of hurricanes that we had both last summer and the year before.
Bill just gave you credit for moving more quickly than DoD on implementing some of these new, more innovative authorities. To the extent that you have done that, what's been the secret sauce in terms of not just putting the regulations in place, but getting acquisition professionals to use them and breaking past some of those cultural barriers that we talked about earlier?
Much of what we're trying to focus on, not just in GSA, but across the federal agencies, is what I call taking the fear out of acquisition. Often, we have built a culture where the safest course is to do what we've always done. But you're never going to get a better result doing exactly the same things you've always done in the past. If you're lucky, you'll keep replicating. But your fourth generation copy is not as good as your original. So things do decay over time. So we're trying to give our folks the authority, the training, the tools, the information to say, when we need to change a process, we're going to give you the top cover. We're going to give you the information. We're going to issue the deviations, the support for it. DHS did a great job setting up a procurement innovation lab where they're at the central office level, they're sending a message across the whole department in and around the importance of bringing innovation into the acquisition cycle. GSA took a different approach, but we're pushing exactly that message about giving the contracting officers permission and cover to be innovative, to be creative. In doing that, Jared, we're trying to set up some real clear guardrails so we don't repeat the mistakes of the 90s. So we can say, hey, this is your authority, this is what you can do, but we're going to do that with toll gates and with process checks before we get in too deep into something new and different.
Soraya Correa from DHS, their chief procurement officer, has called that procurement innovation lab that you mentioned a safe space. And I'd like to hear you say more about what safety actually means in that context, and what are the fears people have that you're trying to keep them safe from?
We're in a world where there's a lot of oversight from a lot of different entities. So we're talking Congress. Frankly, we're talking the media. We're talking the IG community. We're talking the GAO community. We're talking agencies' own review teams. There's lots of interest in how dollars are being spent. There's lots of people who ask lots of questions in and around it. It's so much easier to say, hey, I've done something that's been tested 25 times, and we know the results are predictable. To take a bold new approach, which has a potential huge upside, but has some potential risks, if you don't feel you're going to get the support, if you don't feel that you have your chain of command behind you, you're not going to make those moves. So part of what I understand that Soraya has been trying to do is say, hey, I'm going to support you. She clearly did that with the flash procurement. In GSA, we're trying to send exactly the same message.
I think that's an important point. Congress is not always consistent. Yeah. And so while the Armed Services Committee in the last several years has been pushing authorities out to the department and the U.S. government, the reality is that just a few years earlier, they were concerned about price reasonableness, and they were concerned about a greater oversight over commercial items. And today, you still have questions being asked on other transactions by the appropriators, by various other members of Congress. And so Congress doesn't send as clear a signal as it should. And I can see where that impacts on the culture of the agency trying to execute what are essentially very new and difficult to implement authorities.
Yeah, since you brought up other transactions and the congressional concerns around those, elaborate a little bit on that. What do you see as the concerns from membership being, and how does the Defense Department in particular successfully press forward with these OTAs without causing consternation on the Hill?
I mean, acquisition law and the FAR and DFARs that implement that law are a series of compromises between a series of congressional asks, whether it's for accountability, whether it's for efficiency, whether it's for effectiveness, whether it's for competition, whether it's for social economic goals. And these values don't always jive, and they're in conflict with one another. And so what another transactions does is sets aside that process, and you start off with a kind of a clean sheet of paper, and you negotiate a different type of a contractual arrangement, which does not anticipate, or does not have to anticipate, all of those trade-offs between those acquisition values. So therefore, when you go on down the other transaction path, you may be having more limited competition. You may, for sure, having less intellectual property rights. There's going to be no social economic mandates imposed on it, more than likely. So therefore, there gets concerns by those advocates for those type of acquisition values.
And I'll bring up one concern that you didn't mention, because it's a concern for people in my profession, which is the transparency around OTAs. I mean, one of the things that you don't have to do because it's not a FAR-based procurement, for example, is advertise that you have made an award, or even advertise that you have a requirement. And I think in the case of one of the big OTAs that just got, not just, but got overturned by GAO, in that particular case, there was not even a notification to Congress of what had been a pretty big award. So how much attention should DoD be paying to be making sure it's proactively sharing information about what it's doing in the OT space, even if it's not legally required to do so?
So the big significant thing that the Congress did in the last several years in other transactions was expand it to production. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you can go from cradle to grave in an acquisition, from research and development to production units. And so giving that authority, again, it's a clean sheet of paper. The Department of Defense is going to have to figure out what's the best way to implement and execute these other transactions. And the whole issue of transparency is one that they can obviously put in themselves. And it'd be better for them to figure out the right answer to that, rather than have the Congress legislate, which is obviously they may choose to do so.
All right, we're going to take another short break. This is our panel on FASA Revisited, Precedents in Commercial Item Preference, on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.